The sound of a silver spoon striking a crystal glass rings through the silent, expectant ballroom. Rick Gonzalo has just finished sneering about Lori's kitchen door entrance, expecting her to crumble. Instead, a deep, resonant voice with a slight melodic edge, one that carries more weight than any Gonzalo in the room, cuts through the whispers. Mr. Gonzalo, you are speaking to the most important person in this building. I suggest you choose your next words as if your entire portfolio depends on them. Because it does. As the crowd parts, Lee Min-suk steps into the golden glow of the chandeliers. The focus is placed on the undeniable contrast between him and the elite guests. While Rick is flushed and frantic, Min-suk is a pillar of old money steel, his black tuxedo fitting him like armor. The shock stems from the fact that Lee Min-suk, a reclusive billionaire who has famously refused to meet with the Gonzalo family for years, is not only present, but is standing in a protective, proprietary stance beside Lori Coley. His intense, narrow gaze and the authoritative way he places a hand on the small of her back create an immediate question for the audience. How does the world's most untouchable donor know this woman, and why is he willing to destroy a dynasty to protect her? The mirrors in the penthouse suite were floor to ceiling, reflecting a version of Lori Coley that felt like a quiet revolution. Outside, the city lights of Atlanta sprawled toward the horizon, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive hair lacquer, and the nervous energy of a woman about to walk back into a fire she had barely survived. Stand still, Lori. If I poke you with this earring, don't blame me, Chloe muttered, her fingers steady despite the frantic pace of the evening. Chloe had been there 8 years ago, holding the bucket when Lori's world collapsed, and she was here now, adjusting a diamond stud with the precision of a surgeon. Lori looked at her reflection. The navy blue silk of her gown caught the light like the deep ocean at midnight, its V-neckline framing the delicate clustered diamonds at her throat. Her afro was a perfect soft halo, a crown of natural texture that she had once been told was too unprofessional for the Gonzalo family's aesthetic. You look like a dream, baby. A soft voice came from the doorway. Lori turned to see her mother, Florence, leaning against the frame. Florence's face was a map of grace and resilience, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and a mother's instinctive fear. She knew better than anyone what that ballroom represented. She remembered the nights Lori had spent staring at a silent phone after Rick Gonzalo's parents decided a girl from a working-class background didn't fit the brand of their multi-generational empire. I don't feel like a dream, Ma, Lori admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. I feel like I'm putting on armor to go to a war I already lost once. You didn't lose, Lori, Florence said, stepping into the room and taking her daughter's hands. Her grip was warm and grounding. They threw you out because they couldn't dim you. You were a star they couldn't claim, so they tried to tell you that you were just a spark. But look at you now. Chloe stepped back, crossing her arms as she admired her handiwork. Exactly. This isn't the girl who left with her clothes in a trash bag and a heart in 1,000 pieces. You're the woman who built a consultancy that even Lee Min-suk, the man who treats billionaires like interns, calls a necessity. If Rick Gonzalo tries to look down his nose at you tonight, he's going to realize he's looking up at a giant. Lori took a deep breath, the silk of her bodice tightening against her ribs. The trauma of the past was a heavy thing. It lived in the back of her throat, a phantom taste of the humiliation she'd felt when Rick's mother had handed her a check for $50,000 and told her to disappear quietly, for the sake of the family's public image. Why am I doing this? Lori asked, more to herself than them. I could stay here. We could order room service and watch a movie. I don't need their validation. You don't need their validation, Florence agreed. But they need to see your truth. Not for them, Lori. For every girl who thinks a man like Ricardo Gonzalo gets to decide where she belongs. You're going back to that lion's den to show them that the lion doesn't live there anymore. You do. The chime of a cell phone interrupted the moment. Lori checked the screen. It was a brief, encrypted message from Lee Min-suk's office. The car is downstairs. The stage is set. Lori straightened her shoulders, her posture becoming perfectly upright. The almond-shaped eyes in the mirror were no longer clouded with memory. They were dark, steady, and focused. She wasn't just Lori Coley, the girl who had been dumped and discarded. She was the architect of a new legacy. Let's go, Lori said, her voice finally finding its steel. As she walked toward the door, her navy train whispering against the carpet, She didn't look back. She was heading into the lion's den, and for the first time in 8 years, she wasn't the one who should be afraid. The rain in Atlanta that night hadn't been a gentle mist. It was a torrential downpour that seemed determined to wash Lori away from the Gonzalo estate. 8 years later, the memory of that water slicking the marble steps still felt cold against her skin. At 22, Lori had believed that love was a shield. She had spent 18 months convinced that the way Rick looked at her, with a mix of awe and desperation, was enough to bridge the chasm between her world and his. But as she stood in the center of the Gonzalo library, surrounded by first edition books and the suffocating scent of beeswax and old money, the shield shattered. Rick wouldn't look at her. He stood by the fireplace, his square jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames rather than the woman he had promised to marry just 3 months prior. "My father saw the photos, Lori," Rick said, his voice devoid of the warmth she had come to rely on. "The protest. You were in the front row, shouting into a megaphone. Do you have any idea what that looks like for a family trying to secure a municipal contract?" "It looks like I care about our community, Rick," Lori replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "It looks like your fiancé has a backbone. Why is that a problem?" "Because the Gonzales don't have backbones that public," a sharp feminine voice interrupted. Rick's mother, Beatrice, stepped into the room. She was draped in silk and a silence that felt like a death sentence. She didn't look at Lori as a person. She looked at her as a smudge on a pristine window. "We are a brand, Miss Coley. A legacy. My son is a future CEO, not a revolutionary's husband." Lori turned to Rick, waiting for the defense that never came. "Rick? Tell her. Tell her it doesn't matter." Rick finally looked at her, but the man she loved wasn't behind his eyes. In his place was a businessman calculating a loss. "They're cutting me off, Lori. The inheritance, the position at the firm. Everything. My father said if I marry you, I'm dead to the estate. So choose me," Lori whispered, stepping toward him. "We don't need their money. We have my advocacy work, your talent." "With what?" Rick snapped, finally breaking his composure. His face was flushed, the same ugly shade of red she knew he would wear tonight at the gala. "I don't know how to be poor, Lori. I don't want to learn. You were a beautiful distraction, but you aren't worth the price of my life." The word distraction hit harder than any physical blow. Beatrice stepped forward then, placing a thin, pale check on the mahogany table between them. $50,000. It was a staggering amount of money to a girl whose mother worked double shifts to keep the lights on, but to the Gonzales it was merely the cost of taking out the trash. "This is for your inconvenience," Beatrice said coldly. "There is a non-disclosure agreement attached. You will sign it, you will leave, and you will never mention my son's name in public again. If you don't, we will make sure your mother's small catering business vanishes overnight. We have the reach, Lori. Don't test it." Lori looked at the check, then at Rick. He was staring at the fire again, already mourning her as if she were a ghost. She realized then that he wasn't being forced, he was being relieved. She was the weight he was finally allowed to drop to keep his balloon afloat. She didn't take the check. She didn't sign the paper. She simply turned and walked toward the door, her cheap heels clicking on the expensive floor for the last time. "You're making a mistake, Rick," she had said at the door, her voice a ghost of the woman she would become. "One day you're going to realize that money can buy a wife, but it can't buy a partner. And you just threw away the only person who actually knew who you were." She had walked out into the storm, the rain soaking her to the bone, with nothing but her dignity and a hole in her heart. She had spent the bus ride home crying until her throat was raw, promising herself that she would never, ever let someone else define her value again. Now, as the limousine pulled up to that same estate 8 years later, Lori adjusted her diamond necklace. The girl in the rain was gone. The woman in the navy silk had arrived, and this time, she wasn't leaving until the fire in that library was out for good. The years following the storm at the Gonzalo estate were not defined by the grand sweeping gestures of a movie montage, but by the gritty, unglamorous friction of survival. Lori had traded the silk sundresses of her youth for a rotating wardrobe of thrifted blazers and the persistent scent of industrial-strength coffee. She worked 3 jobs: a junior analyst by day, a freelance grant writer by night, and a daughter every moment in between, nursing Florence through the stress-induced illnesses that came with nearly losing their home. She became a ghost in the industry, the silent architect behind some of the most successful social advocacy campaigns in the country. She didn't need her name on the letterhead. She needed the checks to clear. She learned to weaponize the very thing the Gonzalos had mocked, her ability to see the people they ignored. While Rick was busy at country clubs, Lori was on the ground, mapping out the economic data of the underserved. It was this data that eventually landed on the desk of Lee Min-suk. Min-suk was a myth in the venture capital world, a man whose investments could shift the GDP of small nations. He was also notoriously difficult to reach. When Lori was summoned to a private glass-walled office in a skyscraper that seemed to pierce the very clouds of Manhattan, she didn't expect a conversation. She expected a dismissal. She stood in the center of the minimalist room, her almond-shaped eyes steady, refusing to be intimidated by the cold, sharp geometry of the space. When Min-suk turned around, he didn't look like the billionaire she had known. He didn't have Rick's performative charm or Beatrice's fragile vanity. He had the presence of a mountain, still, ancient, and immovable. His jet-black hair was swept back with lethal precision, and his narrow eyes scanned her not as a woman, but as a blueprint. "You wrote the proposal for the Urban Renewal Initiative," Min-suk said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, carrying a melodic authority that commanded the air in the room. "I did," Lori replied, her posture perfectly upright. "Though the firm I work for took the credit." Min-suk stepped closer, his tailored black suit catching the afternoon sun. "The firm provided the logo. You provided the soul. Your analysis of the invisible economy is the most sophisticated piece of sociology I have read in a decade. Why are you hiding behind a desk that doesn't belong to you?" Lori felt a flicker of the old shame, the ghost of the library flashback. "I was told my perspective was too radical for the mainstream, that I should stay in the shadows if I wanted to keep my career." Min-suk's expression didn't soften, but his intensity shifted. It became protective, a sharp, angular disapproval of the world that had tried to dim her. "The mainstream is a stagnant pool, Miss Coley. I prefer the current. I am launching a global foundation. I have the capital, but I lack the vision you possess. I don't want a consultant. I want a partner." Lori looked at him, searching for the catch. "You know who I am? Who I was associated with. I know that Ricardo Gonzalo is a man who counts pennies while he loses gold," Min-suk said, a rare, cold smirk touching his lips. "I am not interested in your past. I am interested in the woman who survived it. I am offering you the resources to build an empire that will make the Gonzalo estate look like a dollhouse. The only condition is that you stop apologizing for your brilliance." That afternoon, over a single cup of tea that cost more than Lori's first car, a pact was formed. For the next 3 years they worked in a fever of intellectual synergy. Min-suk provided the shield. Lori provided the sword. He watched her transform, seeing the way her deep brown skin seemed to glow with a new, inner authority as she realized she was no longer a distraction. She was the destination. He became more than a donor. He became the one person who saw the halo of her curls not as a statement of rebellion, but as a crown of authenticity. And as they prepared for the Gonzalo charity gala, Min-suk didn't just see a business opportunity. He saw a chance to show the world exactly what happens when you try to bury a diamond in the dirt. "Are you ready to see them again?" he had asked her the night before the event, his hand hovering near hers but never quite touching, out of a profound, structured respect. Lori had looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the steady light of a woman who finally knew her own worth. "I'm not going back to see them, Min-suk. I'm going back so they can finally see me." The limousine pulled up to the grand entrance of the Gonzalo estate, its tires crunching over the same gravel that had once felt like a bed of thorns beneath Lori's feet. Through the tinted glass, the mansion loomed like a fortress of white stone and arrogance, every window ablaze with golden light. 8 years ago, she had fled this place in a downpour, her hair matted and her heart in ruins. Tonight, the air was clear, and the moon hung sharp and silver in the sky. Lori felt the weight of the diamonds against her skin. The necklace was light, a delicate cluster of stones that shimmered with a cold, expensive fire, yet it felt as heavy as a suit of armor. Beside her, Lee Min-suk remained silent, his profile sharp and unreadable in the dim interior of the car. He didn't offer a pep talk. He knew she didn't need one. His presence was a steady frequency, a grounding force that allowed her to find her own center. The board of directors is already inside, Min-suk said, his voice a low vibration. Along with the press. They are expecting a donor. They are not expecting the woman who actually holds the keys. Lori adjusted the silk of her navy gown, the fabric fluid and cool against her legs. They're expecting the Lori Coley who didn't know how to fight back. They're expecting a ghost. Then show them the haunting, Min-suk replied. The door was opened by a white-gloved attendant, and as Lori stepped out, the evening air caught her afro, lifting the soft, voluminous curls like a dark halo. She didn't hesitate. She climbed the marble steps with a posture so perfectly upright it seemed to command the very stone beneath her. As she crossed the threshold into the grand ballroom, the transition was physical. The hum of 100 elite conversations, the scent of expensive lilies, and the clinking of crystal hit her all at once. For a split second, the ghost of the library flashback threatened to surface, the memory of Beatrice's cold sneer and Rick's cowardly silence. But then she felt Min-suk step up behind her, his shadow long and authoritative, and the phantom vanished. The room didn't go silent immediately, but a ripple of curiosity followed her path. Lori didn't look for Rick, yet she felt the stares. She was a vision of deep brown skin and midnight silk, moving with a restrained elegance that made the more ostentatious gowns in the room look like costumes. Her almond-shaped eyes remained steady, focused on the far end of the ballroom where the podium stood. Is that? A woman's voice whispered from a nearby cluster of socialites, the words trailing off into a hiss of disbelief. Lori didn't turn. She knew they were dissecting her, the gold digger who had been vanished by an NDA, now standing in the center of their sanctuary wearing diamonds that outshone their own. She could feel the heat of their judgment, the systemic exclusion that had once made her feel small. But tonight the navy silk was a shield. She wasn't here to ask for a seat at their table. She was here to reveal that she had built her own. Near the champagne fountain, she caught a glimpse of a familiar square jawline. Rick Gonzalo was standing with a group of investors, his fair skin slightly flushed from the wine, laughing at a joke with the easy, unearned confidence of a man who believed the world belonged to him. He hadn't seen her yet. He was still the king of his small, hollow hill. Lori took a deep breath, the diamonds at her throat catching the light of the massive chandeliers above. The weight of the moment was immense, the intersection of her past trauma and her future power. She looked at Min-suk, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod, his narrow eyes fixed on the target. The stage was set. The target was in sight. And as Lori Coley walked deeper into the den of the lions, she realized for the first time that she wasn't just wearing armor. She was the one leading the charge. The air in the ballroom was a cocktail of expensive perfume and whispered conspiracies. But as Lori moved toward the back of the hall, the temperature seemed to drop. She needed a moment of stillness before the inevitable collision with the Gonzalo family, a breath of air away from the predatory eyes of the elite. Near the service entrance, tucked behind a screen of towering palms, she found a familiar face that didn't belong to the world of velvet and diamonds. Gala Simpson stood there, smoothing her pristine white apron, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted a tray of hors d'oeuvres. To the rest of the room, Gala was invisible. A part of the service staff, the guests walked through as if they were ghosts. But to Lori, Gala was the mother of her childhood friend, the woman who had brought her Tupperware containers of warm food when Lori's own kitchen was empty. Lori, Gala whispered, her eyes widening as she took in the navy silk and the radiant glow of the woman before her. Lord, child, I almost didn't recognize you. You look like justice itself. Lori stepped closer, her expression softening into a genuine smile. It's good to see you, Miss Gala. You're the only real thing in this room. But Gala's smile didn't last. She looked over her shoulder toward the center of the ballroom where the Gonzalo family was holding court, then leaned in close, the scent of lavender and starch clinging to her. Lori, listen to me. I was in the library clearing the tea service an hour ago. Ricardo. He's been drinking. He's angry, baby. I heard him talking to his mother. Lori felt the weight of the diamonds at her throat grow heavier. What did he say? He knows you're here, Gala said, her voice dropping to a frantic hum. He thinks you're here to beg, or to make a scene because your mother's house is in trouble. He told Beatrice he was going to make an example of you tonight. He's going to wait until the speeches start. He's going to call you out, humiliate you in front of the donors, call you a professional squatter who snuck in. He wants to destroy any chance you have of being taken seriously in this city. Gala reached out, her rough, hard-working hand briefly touching Lori's silk sleeve. He thinks you're still that girl who left in the rain. He's going to try to strip you down in front of everyone, Lori. He's got the microphone and he's got the crowd. He thinks he's the only one with a voice. A cold, familiar dread tried to take root in Lori's chest, the old reflex of the victim. She could see it clearly. The spotlight, the sneering faces, the amplified voice of the man she once loved telling lies that would stick like tar. Lori, Gala prompted, her eyes full of maternal worry. Maybe you should leave. Go before they start. There's no shame in protecting yourself. Lori looked past Gala, her almond-shaped eyes finding Lee Min-suk across the room. He was standing alone, a silent monolith of power, his narrow eyes already tracking Rick's movements. He had told her that the mainstream was a stagnant pool and he preferred the current. If she left now, she would be letting the stagnant water drown her for a second time. Thank you for the warning, Miss Gala, Lori said, her voice finding a depth of steel that made the older woman blink. But the last time I left this house I was running. I'm not running anymore. But he's a Gonzalo, Gala whispered. In this room, his word is law. In this room, he's a man who hasn't realized the law has changed, Lori replied. She straightened her posture, her afro framing her face like a halo of defiance. She realized that Rick wasn't just planning a scene. He was handing her the very platform she needed. He was going to provide the tension and she, with Min-suk at her back, was going to provide the outcome. Lori squeezed Jala's hand. Go back to the kitchen, Miss Gala. You don't want to be caught in the crossfire. But keep the doors open. I want you to hear what happens next. As she stepped away from the palms and back into the golden light of the ballroom, the weight of the diamonds no longer felt like armor. They felt like a promise. The hunter was about to become the prey, and Lori Coley was finally ready to stop being a distraction and start being the reckoning. The golden light of the chandelier seemed to intensify, reflecting off the crystal flutes and polished marble until the room felt like a gilded cage. Lori could feel the shift in the atmosphere before she saw him. The ambient hum of the gala sharpened into a jagged silence as Ricardo Gonzalo detached himself from a group of silver-haired men, the very board of directors who held the purse strings of the city's philanthropic future. Rick didn't just walk. He swaggered, his fair skin flushed a deep telltale crimson. He stopped 3 feet from Lori, his square jaw set in a sneer that didn't quite hide the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the navy silk and the diamonds at her throat with a performative disdain. Well, well, Rick projected, his voice loud enough to draw a perimeter of curious onlookers. I have to hand it to you, Lori. You always did have a knack for finding the right costume. I assume the dress is a rental? Or did you find a new benefactor to foot the bill for tonight's masquerade? Lori didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her posture so perfectly upright it made Rick's aggressive lean look desperate. It's a beautiful evening, Ricardo. It's a shame you're spending it focused on my wardrobe, rather than the cause we're all here to support. A few members of the board exchanged uneasy glances, but Rick, fueled by scotch and a decade of unearned superiority, pushed further. He turned to the directors, gesturing toward Lori as if she were a piece of evidence in a trial. Gentlemen, I apologize for the breach in security, Rick said, his tone dripping with fake concern. Some of you might recognize Miss Coley. She was a brief associate of mine years ago, before she tried to baby-trap her way into my family's estate. My mother had to personally escort her out after she caught her trying to audit our private accounts. The lie was so bold, so calculated in its cruelty, that a collective gasp rippled through the nearby guests. Lori felt the old sting of the library flashback, the feeling of being silenced by a check and an NDA. She saw Beatrice Gonzalo watching from the edge of the circle, a thin, triumphant smile on her face. I'm surprised you have the nerve to show your face here, Lori, Rick continued, stepping closer until he was in her personal space. Did you think that wearing a few carrots and a designer gown would make us forget you're the same girl who left here in a rainstorm with nothing but a trash bag? This isn't a place for social climbers and failed activists. This is a room for people who actually contribute to society. Security is on their way, so if you have any dignity left, I'd suggest you use the service exit. It's the one you're most familiar with, isn't it? The insult hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Lori's almond-shaped eyes remained steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the board members. Men she knew were currently reviewing her economic data for a $10 million urban initiative, though they didn't yet know it was hers. Is that your official position, Ricardo? Lori asked, her voice calm and terrifyingly clear. That I don't belong in this room because I don't have the Gonzalo name? Or is it because you're afraid that if I stay, people might start asking why your family's foundation has lost 40% of its impact since I stopped auditing your accounts? Rick's face went from flush to a ghostly mottled white. His mouth opened, but before he could bark another insult, a shadow fell over the group. It was a cold, commanding presence that seemed to drain the warmth from Rick's bravado. Lee Min-suk stepped into the circle. He didn't look at Rick. He looked only at Lori, his narrow, intense eyes offering a silent, metallic support. He placed a steady hand on the small of her back, a gesture of proprietary protection that made the board of directors collectively hold their breath. Mr. Gonzalo, Min-suk said, his voice a low, melodic blade that cut through the tension. I was under the impression this was a charity gala, not a theater for your personal insecurities. I find your tone unprofessional, and your facts highly inaccurate. Rick stammered, his eyes darting between the Korean billionaire and the woman he had just tried to ruin. Mr. Lee, you don't understand. This woman, she's a fraud. She's here uninvited. She is here as my guest, Min-suk interrupted, his voice rising just enough to command the entire ballroom. And as the chief executive of the initiative you are all here to fund. If she leaves through the service exit, I suggest you follow her. Because my capital goes where she goes. The silence that followed was absolute. Lori felt the shift, the moment the hunter became the prey. She looked at Rick, not with anger, but with a profound, quiet pity. The lion's den was gone. There was only the truth, and it was about to set the entire room on fire. The atmosphere in the ballroom, which only moments ago had been thick with Rick Gonzalo's venom, suddenly crystallized into a chilling, expectant silence. It was the kind of silence that preceded a lightning strike, charged, heavy, and dangerous. Lee Min-suk didn't raise his voice, yet the low, melodic resonance of his words seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, grounding Lori while the world around Rick began to tilt. Min-suk stepped fully into the golden spill of the center chandelier, his presence expanding until he seemed to occupy the entire room. He was a pillar of midnight black wool and sharp, angular shadows. He didn't look like a man attending a party. He looked like a sovereign inspecting a failing province. His narrow, intense eyes fixed on Rick with a predatory focus that made the younger man's flushed face turn a sickly, translucent gray. I find it curious, Mr. Gonzalo, Min-suk began, his tone deceptively conversational, that you speak so loudly of security and exits when you are currently standing in a building that is being appraised for a hostile takeover. A takeover, I might add, that was initiated because of the very audits you claim were a crime. Rick's mouth opened but no sound came out. He looked like a man caught in the middle of a collapsing bridge. He glanced at the board of directors, seeking a familiar anchor, but the silver-haired men were already stepping back, their loyalties shifting with the speed of a falling guillotine. They knew the weight of the name Lee Min-suk. They knew that a single phone call from the man standing before them could erase the Gonzalo legacy by sunrise. Min-suk turned his gaze slightly, not to the crowd but to Lori. The protective hand on the small of her back remained steady, a silent promise of war and victory. Miss Coley is not a guest of the Gonzalo family. She is the reason I am here. She is the architect of the Global Equity Fund. The fund your family has been begging to join for 18 months. A collective, audible gasp swept through the ballroom. The gold digger was the gatekeeper. The distraction was the decision-maker. Rick stumbled back a half-step, his bravado finally dissolving into raw, naked panic. Mr. Lee, there must be some mistake. She was nothing. We had to pay her to. You didn't pay her to leave, Ricardo, Min-suk interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried further than any shout. He took a single step forward, and Rick instinctively cringed, the square jawline that had been so arrogant moments ago now trembling. You paid for the privilege of not having her expose your incompetence sooner. But that debt has come due. And I do not like the way you talk to my partner. The look Min-suk gave Rick was not one of anger, but of absolute moral certainty. It was the look of a man who had already won. He didn't need to shout. The narrow intensity of his eyes communicated a finality that silenced Rick more effectively than any physical blow. The younger Gonzalo looked down at his own polished shoes, his shoulders slumping as the social consequences of his outburst began to settle over him like ash. Min-suk scanned the rest of the board members, his expression a mask of cold, sharp disapproval. The presentation will proceed in 10 minutes. Miss Coley will be leading it. If anyone in this room has a problem with her presence, the valet is waiting to bring your cars around. I suggest you decide if you value your pride or your portfolios more. Without waiting for a response, Min-suk looked at Lori. The stern, authoritative line of his mouth softened, just for a fraction of a second, in a gesture of profound respect. He offered her his arm, his jet black sleeve a stark contrast to the deep navy of her gown. Lori reached out, her fingers brushing the expensive fabric of his suit. She felt the warmth of his strength, but more importantly she felt her own. She wasn't just standing behind a billionaire. She was standing beside an equal. As they began to move toward the podium, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, the whispers now filled with a frantic, desperate kind of reverence. Rick was left standing in the center of the floor, a ghost in his own house, while Lori Coley walked toward the light. The alpha had stepped in, but the queen was about to speak. The silence in the ballroom was no longer empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the collective heartbeat of 100 people, who realized they were standing on a fault line. At the center of the room, near the velvet-draped podium, Lee Min-suk stood with his hand still resting on Lori's back. A gesture that felt less like a comfort and more like a declaration of sovereignty. Min-suk reached into the breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo and withdrew a single obsidian black card, placing it on the edge of the podium. The board members leaned in, their eyes widening as they recognized the seal of the Aegis Global Fund. For the past 3 months, Min-suk began, his voice dropping into a melodic register that commanded the farthest corners of the room. This board has been courting an anonymous donor for a $20 million endowment. You have sent countless emails, offered naming rights to buildings, and promised seats on every committee. You were looking for a savior with a checkbook. He paused, his narrow, intense eyes sweeping over Beatrice Gonzalo, who was frozen like a statue of salt, and then landing on Rick, who looked as if he were trying to disappear into the very floorboards he had swaggered across moments ago. I am that donor, Min-suk stated, the words dropping like lead weights into a still pond. But I did not come here to save your name, Mr. Gonzalo. I came here to finalize a deal that was never yours to manage. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the guests. Rick's mouth hung open, his fair skin now a ghostly mottled white. Mr. Lee, I had no idea. If I had known you were the one. If you had known I was the one, you would have hidden your cruelty behind a mask of professional courtesy, Min-suk interrupted, his tone chillingly sharp. But that is the problem with men who only respect power. They eventually insult the person who actually holds it. Min-suk turned fully toward Lori, and for the first time, his expression transitioned from cold iron to a profound, visible reverence. He stepped back from the microphone, gesturing for her to take the center. The Aegis Global Fund does not move on my whim, Min-suk announced to the room, his voice rising with a protective pride. I provide the capital, yes. But the strategy, the economic modeling, and the vision that brought this foundation to the top of the global market belong to one person. Every initiative you are currently celebrating, the very ones the Gonzalo family has claimed as their visionary expansion, was written, researched, and executed by Lori Coley. Lori felt the breath leave the room. The board members looked at her as if she had just materialized out of thin air. They were looking at the gold digger, the distracted girl, and seeing for the first time the architect of their own survival. Lori is not my associate, Min-suk continued, his gaze narrowing as he looked back at the board. She is the managing partner. She is the brain behind the empire. When I say that my capital goes where she goes, I mean it literally. If she decides this foundation is no longer a viable investment because of its toxic leadership, I withdraw the endowment tonight. And I believe we all know what that would do to the Gonzalo Group's credit rating by morning. Rick stumbled back, his hand catching the edge of a banquet table to steady himself. The reality was crashing down. He had just publicly insulted the woman who held the literal survival of his family's legacy in her hands. He looked at Lori, his eyes pleading, searching for a trace of the girl who had once loved him, the girl who would have forgiven him. But that girl had died in a library 8 years ago. Lori stepped up to the microphone, her navy blue gown shimmering under the chandelier light, her afro framing her face like a halo of absolute authority. She didn't look at the checkbooks or the diamonds in the room. She looked at the faces of the people who had spent a decade trying to convince her she was a distraction. "Thank you, Min Suk," Lori said, her voice steady and echoing with a power that needed no amplification. She turned her almond-shaped eyes toward the board of directors. "Now, shall we discuss the terms of your restructuring? Or should we wait for the security team to finish escorting the uninvited guests out of the building?" As she spoke, the power shift was total. The donor's decree had been issued, and for the first time in history, the Gonzalo estate was no longer the sun. It was merely a planet orbiting a new brilliant star. The air in the ballroom had grown thin, vibrating with a tension that threatened to shatter the crystal chandeliers overhead. Rick Gonzalo stood paralyzed, his eyes darting from the composed brilliance of Lori Coley to the immovable shadow of Lee Min-suk. The revelation of Lori's power was a physical blow, one that stripped away his layers of unearned prestige, until he was nothing but a frightened man in an expensive suit. But cornered animals are often the most dangerous, and Rick was not ready to surrender his kingdom without one last desperate act of sabotage. "This is a farce." Rick's voice cracked, the sound jagged and desperate. He turned to the crowd, his face a mask of sweating mottled rage. "Min-suk, you've been blinded. This woman is a master manipulator. She's hacked her way into your data. She's seduced her way into your confidence. I won't stand by and watch my family's gala be turned into a stage for her delusions." He lunged toward the side of the podium, his hand fumbling for the radio on his belt before he realized he wasn't wearing one. Instead, he began to shout, his arm waving frantically toward the perimeter of the room. "Security! John! Get over here now. We have an intruder who has breached the guest list and is harassing the primary donors. Remove this woman immediately. Use whatever force is necessary." A heavy, synchronized footfall echoed against the marble. Johnny Ward, the head of security, a man whose face was a map of military precision and whose loyalty was rumored to be the bedrock of the Gonzalo estate, led a team of 4 guards toward the center of the floor. The crowd parted in a wave of panicked silk and tuxedos. Beatriz Gonzalo watched from the sidelines, her chin lifted, waiting for the familiar satisfaction of seeing Lori Coley dragged out into the night. Rick pointed a trembling finger at Lori, his eyes wild. "There she is, John. Take her out. Now." Johnny Ward stopped exactly 3 feet from the podium. He didn't look at Rick. His steady, almond-shaped eyes that mirrored the same calm intelligence as Lori's, remained fixed forward. He stood with his shoulders square, his hands clasped behind his back in a stance of absolute dominance. "Mr. Gonzalo," John said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried more authority than Rick had ever possessed. "I suggest you lower your hand." Rick blinked, his mouth falling open. "What are you doing? I gave you an order. I pay your salary." "Actually, Ricardo," Lori interrupted, her voice cool and as smooth as the navy silk of her gown. She stepped forward, the light catching the soft halo of her afro. "You haven't paid John's salary in 18 months. The Gonzalo Group's security contract was quietly absorbed by Aegis Global during the last fiscal restructuring. You've been living in a house guarded by people you no longer employ." Rick froze, the blood draining from his face until he looked like a ghost of the man who had entered the room. He turned to John, his voice a pathetic whisper. "John? What is she talking about?" Johnny Ward finally turned his head, looking at Rick with a cold, professional assessment. "My orders for this evening were very specific, sir. I was instructed to ensure the safety and dignity of the chief executive of the Aegis Initiative. That person is Miss Coley." He paused, his gaze shifting to Lee Min-suk, who offered a single, sharp nod of confirmation. My team and I report only to her and Mr. Lee. If there is an intruder in this room causing a disturbance and harassing the donors, it isn't the woman at the podium. It's the man standing in front of it. The social execution was complete. The board of directors watched in stunned silence, as the very men meant to protect the Gonzalo legacy turned their backs on its heir. John, Lori said, her voice steady and devoid of the malice Rick had shown her. Mr. Gonzalo is clearly unwell. He seems to have forgotten whose house this actually is. Please escort him and his mother to the private library, so they can begin reviewing the exit paperwork. We have a presentation to finish, and I don't want any more distractions. Yes, ma'am, John replied. He didn't have to use force. He simply stepped toward Rick, his presence an immovable wall of reality. Rick looked at Lori one last time, his fair skin now a waxen gray. He looked for a trace of the girl he had discarded, the girl who would have wept at his downfall. But as Lori turned back to the microphone, her diamonds sparkling like cold stars, he realized he was no longer even a memory to her. He was just a line item that had finally been balanced. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from a social gathering to a courtroom, and the air felt electric with the impending storm. As Johnny Ward and his security team moved with silent, lethal efficiency to usher Rick and Beatrice toward the periphery, the heavy double doors at the back of the hall swung open. A sea of camera flashes erupted as the city's lead investigative journalists, previously cordoned off in the foyer, were suddenly allowed entry. Min-suk stepped back to the podium, but he didn't reach for the microphone. Instead, he signaled to a large projection screen behind him. With a single tap on his tablet, the glowing Aegis Global logo was replaced by a series of forensic accounting spreadsheets and internal bank transfers. The numbers were stark, highlighted in aggressive red, detailing a trail of administrative fees that led directly from the charity's primary endowment into the Gonzalo family's private offshore holdings. For years, Min-suk's voice boomed, amplified by the speakers until it shook the very foundations of the mansion. This gala has been touted as a beacon of hope for the city. But the data doesn't lie. While you were being asked to open your hearts and your wallets, the Gonzalo Group was using your generosity to patch the holes in their failing real estate empire. Over $12 million meant for urban housing and medical relief has been diverted into private maintenance for this very estate and the personal debts of Ricardo Gonzalo. The room exploded into a cacophony of gasps and frantic whispers. Reporters surged forward, their microphones thrust toward the stage like bayonets. Rick, caught in the grip of two guards, looked like a cornered animal, his fair skin turning a ghastly translucent shade of white as the flashes captured his every tremor. Beatrice let out a strangled cry of protest, but her voice was drowned out by the sheer weight of the evidence on the screen. Lori stood beside Min-suk, her expression one of calm, sorrowful gravity. She didn't feel the surge of vindictive joy she had once imagined. Instead, she felt a profound sense of closure. She looked at the spreadsheets, the same documents she had spent nights deciphering in the shadows, and felt the weight of the Gonzalo lies finally lifting. The Aegis Initiative is not just here to donate, Lori said, her voice cutting through the noise with a resonant, unshakable authority. We are here to liquidate. As of 6 o'clock this evening, the Aegis Global Fund has acquired the outstanding debt of the Gonzalo Foundation. This charity no longer belongs to the family that bears its name. It belongs to the people it was meant to serve. And as for the mismanagement, she paused, her almond-shaped eyes finding Rick's desperate gaze. The evidence currently on that screen has already been delivered to the district attorney's office. The finality of her words hit Rick like a physical blow. The prestige he had used as a weapon, the name he had used to humiliate her, and the wealth he had used to buy her silence were all dissolving in the heat of the camera lights. He was no longer the Prince of Atlanta. He was a headline in a scandal he couldn't survive. Min-suk placed a steady, protective hand on Lori's shoulder, a gesture of absolute moral certainty. He looked at the press, then at the board of directors who were now scrambling to distance themselves from the crumbling Gonzalo legacy. The evening is over, Min-suk announced, his narrow eyes flashing with a cold, triumphant light. But the work of the Aegis Initiative has just begun. My partner and I will be taking no further questions tonight. We have a legacy to rebuild. One based on truth, not on the vanity of a dying name. As the security team began to clear the room, Lori turned away from the screen and the chaos. She looked at the grand ballroom, the place that had once been her prison, and saw it for what it was, just a room. The power was no longer in the walls or the name. It was in the woman standing in the center of it all. The chaotic hum of the press and the shell-shocked whispers of the socialites gradually ebbed, pulled under by the sheer gravity of Lori Coley's presence. She stood at the mahogany podium, her fingers lightly grazing the polished wood where Rick had stood moments before to spit venom. She didn't look like the woman who had been ushered out of this house in a storm. She looked like the storm itself, now stilled into a quiet, terrifying beauty. Lee Min-suk stepped off to the side, his shadow long and protective, his narrow eyes fixed on her with a pride that was visible even to the cameras in the back. He had cleared the path, but the ground was hers to claim. Lori reached out and adjusted the microphone. The sound of the feedback was a sharp, singular chime that demanded absolute silence. She looked out at the room, at the board members who had enabled the Gonzalos, at the wealthy donors who had looked through Jayla Simpson for years, and at the cameras that were currently broadcasting her face to the city. For 10 years, Lori began, her voice steady and echoing with a resonant clarity. This gala has been a stage for a lie. It has been a place where the wealthy came to feel good about the crumbs they threw to the people they chose to ignore. You were told that your donations were building futures. Tonight you saw the truth. They were building a fortress for a family that didn't care if the rest of the city burned, as long as their chandeliers stayed lit. She paused, her almond-shaped eyes scanning the front row. I was one of those people they ignored. 8 years ago, I stood in the library of this very house and was told that my voice was a distraction, and that my background was a liability. I was given a price for my silence and told to vanish. But the thing about silence is that it eventually becomes a deafening noise when the truth finally speaks. Lori straightened her posture, the navy silk of her gown shimmering like deep water under the lights. The Aegis Initiative is not just changing the name on the door of this foundation. We are changing its soul. As of tonight, the Gonzalo charity is dissolved. In its place, we are establishing the Simpson-Coley Foundation for Urban Equity. Our mission will no longer be charity, a word that implies a hierarchy of the giver over the receiver. Our mission is investment. A ripple of movement went through the crowd, but Lori didn't stop. We are investing in the mothers like Jayla who keep these houses running, while their own neighborhoods are neglected. We are investing in the small businesses that were threatened with ruin to protect a billionaire's ego. And we are starting that investment by opening the books. Every cent of the $20 million endowment provided by Mr. Lee will be tracked by an independent community board. No more secret transfers. No more administrative fees. No more gold-plated lies. She turned her gaze toward the back of the room, where Jayla Simpson stood in the doorway, her eyes wet with tears, her hand over her heart. Lori offered a small, knowing nod. This city does not belong to the names on the buildings, Lori said, her voice rising with a melodic, undeniable authority. It belongs to the people who build it, who clean it, who advocate for it, and who refuse to be silenced by it. Tonight, the era of the Gonzalo legacy is over. Tonight, we start building something that actually deserves to stand. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of a shift in the world's axis. Then a single person began to clap. It was Johnny Ward, standing by the service entrance. Then Jayla. Then, one by one, the donors who had been waiting for someone to finally tell them the truth joined in. Lori stepped back from the microphone, her diamonds catching the light one last time before the cameras went dark. She looked at Min-suk, and in his intense, narrow gaze, she saw the reflection of the woman she had always been, but had finally found the courage to become. She had delivered the keynote of her life, and for the first time, she wasn't waiting for an answer. She was the answer. The humid night air of Atlanta felt different as Lori stepped out onto the wide stone terrace of the Gonzalo estate. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a prison. It was the cool, expansive breath of a world that had finally been forced to make room for her. Behind the French doors, the frantic flashes of cameras and the desperate murmurs of a falling dynasty were fading, replaced by the rhythmic chirping of cicadas in the manicured gardens below. Lori walked to the edge of the stone balustrade, resting her hands on the cool marble. The navy silk of her gown fluttered in the breeze, a dark shadow against the distant, shimmering lights of the city skyline. She felt a profound stillness in her chest, the kind of peace that only comes when the last debt of a long war has been settled. A shadow moved in the doorway, and the familiar, grounding presence of Lee Min-suk materialized beside her. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, his hands in his pockets, his sharp profile etched against the moon like a statue of obsidian. He looked out at the city he had helped her reclaim, his narrow eyes reflecting the distant glow of 1,000 lives they were about to change. "You didn't look back when they let him out," Min-suk said, his voice a low melodic vibration that carried more warmth than it had all evening. Lori shook her head slowly, her afro catching the silver moonlight. "There was nothing left to see, Min-suk. Ricardo was a ghost long before tonight. I spent 8 years haunted by a man who was never actually there. Watching him leave felt quiet, like closing a book I should have finished a long time ago." Min-suk turned toward her, his expression controlled but his gaze intense. "The board of directors is already calling my office. They are terrified. They want to know if the Simpson-Coley Foundation is hiring. They want to know how to get on your good side." Lori let out a small genuine laugh, the first one that felt entirely hers in years. "Let them wait. For once, let them be the ones standing in the rain, wondering if they're enough." Min-suk stepped closer, the tailored lines of his tuxedo overlapping with the fluid silk of her dress. He didn't reach for her in a way that suggested possession. Instead, he offered a hand, palm up, in a gesture of absolute, structured respect. It was the silent invitation of a partner who recognized her as his equal in every sense of the word. "To the beginning," he said softly. "The empire we build now won't be made of marble and lies, Lori. It will be made of the things you brought into that room tonight. Truth, vision, and a strength they couldn't break because they didn't know how it was forged." Lori placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and steady, a promise of the era to come. She looked up at him, her almond-shaped eyes bright with the realization that the secret investor hadn't just given her capital. He had given her a mirror until she finally saw what he saw. "To the beginning," she echoed. Behind them, the Gonzalo name was being stripped from the walls, but out here under the vast, uncaring stars, a new legacy was taking root. They stood together on the terrace, two architects of a future that no longer required them to hide in the shadows. As they walked back toward the lights of the city, Lori Coley didn't just feel like a survivor. She felt like a queen who had finally come home to a kingdom she had built with her own 2 hands.